Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bombe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and the author of 4 baking books. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today, I'm chatting with Chef Susan Bay, the pastry chef of Moon Rabbit, the popular Vietnamese restaurant in Washington, D.C. Susan is known for her unique desserts that marry savory and sweet, like green curry sponge cake with avocado sorbet and fish sauce caramel. Her creativity makes her such an exciting chef to watch. In this episode, Susan and I talk about using fresh produce and herbs in desserts, why it's important to her to push people to try new ingredients, and creating dishes that mimic nature. We also go through the recipe for her chocolate mayonnaise cake. I adore using mayo in chocolate cake as it lends a richness and flavor and an extra moist texture. And Susan and I chat about how we think it would also be great in a red velvet cake. Susan was a delight to speak to, and I know you'll love her story. Stay tuned for our chat. If you'd like to follow along, you can find today's recipe at cherrybombe.com. Today's episode is presented by California prunes, the best kind of prunes out there. I am a big fan of California prunes for 2 reasons. They're a great addition to your pantry when it comes to smart snacking and baking. You probably already know that prunes are good for your gut. You might even know that prunes are also good for your bone health. But what you really need to know is that prunes are absolutely delicious in both sweet and savory dishes. But don't just take it from me. Here's what some of the country's top culinary experts have to say. Chef Bronwyn Wyatt of Bayou St. Cake says, prunes have an earthy, winey richness that pairs beautifully with the tart, fresh flavor of berries. Chef Kat Turner from Highly Likely in LA says, they are an incredibly versatile ingredient that strike a great balance between sweet and savory. They are incredibly sensual. Ana Castro from Akamaya in New Orleans says, prunes have a sultriness to them. They are very rich and like velvet. I like to use prune puree in my baked goods to give them great flavor and also to replace some of the sugar, eggs, or fat in the recipe. It's super easy to whip up. Just blend prunes and water together and voila! For recipe ideas and more, be sure to check out the California Prunes website at californiaprunes.org. Happy baking and happy snacking. I have big news for you. My new cookbook, Salty, Cheesy, Herby, Crispy, Snackable Bakes, will be available Tuesday, September 24th. This is my first savory baking book, and I'm so excited to share it with all of you. It features 100 easy-peasy baking recipes for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and of course, snacking. From sage butter scones to smash burger hand pies and tomato za'atar galette. You'll also find 6 of my essential savory baking hacks, including how to make my magic melted butter pie dough and the quickest and easiest caramelized onions. I just announced my cookbook tour, and tickets are on sale right now at cherrybombe.com. The launch party will take place in Manhattan on Tuesday, September 24th. Then I'm in San Francisco on Tuesday, October 8th, Chicago on Tuesday, October 15th, and Boston on Wednesday, October 23rd, and I can't wait to see you. Thank you to Kerrygold and King Arthur Flour for supporting my tour. You can also click the link in the show notes of this episode to pre-order the book now, or pick up a copy at your favorite local bookstore starting September 24th. I hope you love salty, cheesy, herby, crispy, snackable bakes as much as I loved writing it. Let's check in with today's guest. Susan! So excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk chocolate mayonnaise cake with ganache frosting with you and so much more.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Jessie.
So you were born and raised in a Korean home in LA, and I wondered if you could share a little bit about the baking and cooking that was happening or not happening in your home when you were growing up.
Yes, so I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents were immigrants. They worked so much. They worked all the time that we didn't really have too many family dinners. And I think because they worked so much, I was left to create meals on my own with my sister. Because they weren't home often, my mom was not the best cook either. But, there was the traditional comfort foods of Korea that, really stuck with me. But everything else I had to teach myself. I think that's where my passion for baking kind of took off.
When it was just you cooking for you and your sister, were you making sort of American dishes? Were you making Korean dishes? And were you always kind of baking for the two of you?
It was mostly American dishes because my parents would always just cook Korean dishes. So yeah, and the baking part, that came later down in like maybe high school era. Yeah.
Can you tell us the story of what you baked for your dad that made you realize that you loved baking?
I made my father, a replica of a McDonald's apple pie. He loves that pie. I attempted it. I had never baked it before, and it wasn't very good. But he enjoyed it so much, and, you know, he was so loving about it. He was very proud of me, and I think that kickstarted my love for baking because I just loved seeing how happy he was.
Did you try and fry it? I won't lie, I haven't had one in a long time, although this is actually making me hungry for one.
So
but I feel like it's an apple hand pie, rectangular shaped, but fried.
Correct, yeah. So I made the pie crust. It was obviously not structurally sound. Probably could have binded the ingredients a little better. But yes, I threw it in the fryer, just like kind of exploded and splooged. Very mangled, but got on the plate and he was like, wow. So I was like, thanks, Dad.
I also think because fried is my favorite food, I think even a sploogey mangled fried apple pie sounds delicious to me.
It was good, but it was definitely not McDonald's.
I know that when you were, maybe it was high school, when you were growing up, you got really into food blogs.
I did.
And can you tell us a little bit about those blogs, which ones you were reading? And they kind of inspired your love of sweets, maybe along with that sploogey mangled apple pie.
There were two blogs that I followed pretty religiously. One was Smitten Kitchen, and the second one was Joy the Baker. And I think a lot of my inspiration came from her as well because, you know, she had moved to New Orleans and she was just doing her thing, and it was just so inspirational, and I loved testing out all of the recipes, so it was great.
So after college, you went to culinary school, and at one point, I think it was post-school, you were working 4 different part-time jobs that you could learn from all different sorts of restaurant experiences. Was that like your idea? You were like, oh, I want a vast variety of experiences to teach myself? Because 4 sounds like a lot.
Yeah. So it was a mix of both, I would say. I was just starting out. I was living alone for a little bit in LA, and I was like, okay, I need money. But at the same time, I still wanted to learn and absorb. So I just kind of dabbled in different restaurants, different bakeries all at once so I could just absorb all of that information. It was tough, but I have no regrets. It was the best times of my life.
And were all of those 4 jobs, were they all in pastry?
Pastry, yeah.
Yeah. I love that. So you've described your dessert style as unique and out of the box, and I assume part of that style was honed during that experience of dipping your toes into so many different types of pastry. But can you unpack what's sort of unique and out of the box about what you do?
I think I learned to really love the element of savory. So I tried to incorporate that along with fresh produce that are local. Growing up in California, we had the farmers markets. So that was very ingrained in my style of work. So I would say fresh produce, fresh herbs, and also an element of savory.
You've said that you're not afraid, obviously, to experiment with flavors in dessert. And you've said that it's important for you to challenge people with your desserts, like putting durian in a dessert and sort of pushing people to try ingredients that are important to other cultures.
Absolutely.
And I feel like Kevin Tien, your partner at Moon Rabbit, is also that sort of the ethos maybe of the restaurant. Is that fair to say?
He is, yeah. This is our heritage. This is our culture. These are foods we eat on any typical day. But in American cuisine, not very common. And most people, again, let's use durian as the example, people are afraid of the fruit because there is a scent. It's very pungent. It smells like gasoline almost at first whiff. But behind that smell is a very delicious, sweet, vanilla-y taste that I think people, they get deterred by the smell initially. But yeah, this food is important to us, right? And so it's about taking our culture, our heritage, and saying, hey, it's not all that scary. It's actually quite delicious. How can we make this, I hate using this word, approachable? I hate using this word, but if you try it in this way, maybe you'll change your mind or maybe you'd be open to it. So we're really big on that.
We'll be right back. Peeps, have you heard the news? Cherry Bomb's first ever Jubilee Wine Country is happening in Napa Valley on October 26th and 27th. It'll be a weekend filled with great wine, winemakers, beautiful food, seasonal produce, conversation, connection, and California. Passes are now available. To learn more and snag a pass, visit cherrybomb.com. I think it's interesting because you talk about savory elements, and I have just written this new book, and it's all about savory baking. But what we're talking about here is different than savory baking, different than like putting cheese or meat into baked goods. It's really about like a plated dessert that is actually taking from the savory kitchen and adding that to this beautiful restaurant dessert.
Right. I think an example would be our new mushroom dessert on the menu, basically highlighting and showcasing mushrooms. So we take a lot of wild foraged mushrooms, blend it up in there. Again, big in our culture, in our cuisine, and allowing people to try that in a different way, not just in stock or in a sauce.
And there are a lot of, at least at Moon Rabbit, a lot of Vietnamese ingredients in your desserts, including things like fish sauce and green curry and soursop. And I love the idea of really like sort of you're pushing the envelope of at least what people's expectations are.
We try. People at work joke around and say, oh, she goes ham sandwich, which means like she just goes crazy, right? But this is how I express my creativity. And when it all comes together in the end, it's very fulfilling for me. And it's also really fulfilling to be able to share that with a new experience with guests as well.
And I've also read that there's a part of the natural world that you sort of grew up in when you were foraging and hiking in California that also sort of influences this more savory side of your baking. How do those two things interact, the savory side and the sort of natural world?
I just love nature. I wish there was a better way to put it, but I feel very passionate about the earth and the world around us. And yes, being in California, hiking, foraging, being immersed in that, the natural environment is very inspiring. When I feel inspired, I create. And so it really shows in the type of work that I put out onto a plate. It's going to look like maybe a log, a piece of driftwood, some moss. We'll adorn it with herbs and flowers. But yeah, nature is very much a part of my pastry style.
I also know that both you and Kevin at Moon Rabbit have said that you want diners to taste traditional Vietnamese food, even if it doesn't look traditional. And is that maybe part of what you were just describing, the way we might see moss or a log, but then the flavors are going to be what is familiar to you guys and maybe not familiar to the diners?
Absolutely. Kevin I think his style is very much more, we want it to look similar and taste similar. For me, it's like people eat with their eyes first, right? And when I'm creating a dish and it looks like nature, it's not just a random thing. Usually it's the geography of Vietnam or a certain area of Vietnam, and then taking those flavors that are relevant to that area and incorporating it. And it kind of comes full circle, I would say. So geographically, it looks like an area, and then all the flavors from that area come into the dish as well.
Was that a big learning curve since you grew up in a Korean home for you to learn sort of? Was Kevin like your teacher in terms of learning about the different flavors, or was it just you on your own sort of experimenting with the cuisine?
So definitely in the beginning, for sure, I always still gain inspiration from all the other chefs at Moon Rabbit, but my very first job was actually at a Southeast Asian restaurant. So that's where my knowledge of most of the ingredients came from. So I was familiarized with a lot of the ingredients because I worked with them all the time. Me being equipped with that knowledge and then paired with the further Vietnamese knowledge and culture that, Kevin and his upbringing, it just created this wonderful sort of force, and we kind of worked together.
I know that you and Kevin were sort of friends on social media, and that was sort of how you both knew about each other's work. But do you think it was your time at that restaurant that sort of also inspired Kevin to ask you to partner with him because he knew you'd already had exposure to the cuisine? Or do you think he just loves you and it wouldn't have mattered?
You know what? I don't know if he knew that I was working with Southeast Asian flavors in the very beginning. At the time when we did become friends, I was working at like a very Californian restaurant. So it's amazing. I think it was like a mix of, I don't know, how can I say
this? Well, some kind of kismet.
Yes, some kind of kismet. And, we did follow each other for a very long time. He's seen my other work. And I think it was just so much trust, right? Yeah. There was a lot of trust. He was just like, yeah, I want you on my team. And we just created this beautiful bond.
Amazing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about your chocolate mayonnaise cake with ganache frosting, which is literally just saying those words makes me so happy, which I believe is unique and out of the box in its own way, though obviously different than the kinds of desserts you're right now creating at Moon Rabbit. So first, can you tell us a little bit about chocolate mayonnaise cakes and how you discovered them?
Again, I think the very first time I discovered was probably on a blog. I can't remember which one, but definitely on a blog first. And then I was just like scrolling through the recipe box. It was like chocolate mayonnaise cake. And I was like, this is weird. This is weird. Why is there mayonnaise in a cake? But, now I think I understand. Okay, eggs, oil makes a lot of sense. But yeah, that is how I first discovered chocolate mayonnaise cake.
I love that. I might have to go back and do like a search of both Deb and Joy's sites to see if one of them has a chocolate.
I'm sure one of them
It feels like something that each of them could have.
Right.
I love them so much. I discovered them. My grandmother had like cut a recipe for one out of a newspaper in like the 1960s or 70s and stuck it in her recipe box.
Yeah, it is.
And I discovered it.
Retro dessert, as they would say.
It is. I wonder if they were kind of created during a time where maybe it was hard to get eggs or more expensive to get eggs. And so it was easier to buy this product that had them already included.
I think you might be right, because I did read somewhere that it started up in the 40s when food was kind of scarce, but then it really gained trajectory around the 60s, and that's when it got really big.
I love that. And I once tried to put mayonnaise into a vanilla-based cake, and I found that I could taste the mayonnaise almost. Have you ever tried to make it with like a different flavored cake? Because I feel like it should work, and I might need to retry.
I have not tried, but I wonder if the chocolate really kind of like masks it a bit and tones it down, because I would assume a vanilla cake with mayonnaise would taste very eggy.
Yeah,
oily.
Yeah, I also remember almost that, how mayonnaise is a teeny bit tangy.
Yeah.
I remember tasting that in the vanilla cake, not in a good way. Whereas I could imagine that if there was an undertone of tang in the chocolate cake, it would sort of almost
melt
work.
Together, right? What about a red velvet? I wonder if that would work.
Honey, genius.
Right?
Yes.
Because there is still a tang, but you still get the cocoa.
I love that idea.
That might work.
I love that. And also, I don't know if this is standard, but I know my own red velvet cake recipe calls for oil. So it's already sort of there.
Oh, Jessie, please create a recipe
for
red velvet mayonnaise.
I'm going to. I wish that I could like stop the interview and take a note, but I have to remember at the end of this to write it down. So this particular cake, often people will use, I think originally, like when we're talking about the 40s and the 60s, people were literally taking out the fat in the cake, melted butter or oil completely, and the eggs, and putting mayo in. But you don't do that. You add the mayo, but you still add a little bit of fat and some of the eggs. Can you talk about why?
I just like the richness. With the mayonnaise, it's already moist, but I want it more moist. So we just add that little extra bit of oil. I like a rich chocolate cake. I don't know about you. But when I crave it, that's what I want. I did try it with less oil. I didn't omit it completely, but it just needed a little bit more.
I have a chocolate mayonnaise cake in my last book, like a snacking cake. And I didn't add extra oil, but I did add an extra egg.
Yeah.
Because I just wanted that unctuousness. I think it gives it a little lift.
It's the spring.
And I know you mostly offer this cake for wholesale. Is that right? It's not usually plated up in the restaurant?
No, so not in the restaurant. We partnered with Any Day Now here in Washington, D.C. at Navy Yard. And, they're an all-day diner. And they were like, we need some cakes. I was like, what are you guys looking for? And they said, old school, retro cakes. And chocolate mayonnaise was one of them. And I actually came up with this recipe specifically for them. But in the restaurant, sometimes when we have events and stuff, we'll create it or as a snack for ourselves. But we don't usually serve it in the restaurant.
First thing we're going to do is we're going to heat our oven to 350 degrees and we're going to grease a sheet pan. So my first question is there a particular size? Is it like a half sheet pan? Do we only need one? I know we're going to be cutting out the cake from this flat cake.
So definitely a half sheet pan. I do cut it out with, it depends on what size you want. I usually don't go beyond an 8.
Can you get 3/8 out of one half sheet pan?
Yes, you can.
Great.
So corner, middle. So you could get 2 halves out of a middle and stick them together.
Oh, brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant. Susan was just doing a lot of pantomiming, which I wish you guys could all see. But, that makes sense.
Yes.
So the third layer, which will be the middle layer,
Right.
is actually 2 halves.
Stuck together.
Interesting. And do you have a half mold? Or, once you
Yes.
flip it out, you're able to do half and half.
Exactly.
So smart. Oh, my
Yes.
God, that's so smart. I probably am the kind of person who would have gotten an entirely new sheet pan.
Such a waste.
Yeah, yeah.
I want all those cake crumbs.
That's great. And are we greasing the pan with cooking spray and lining with parchment?
Yes. So cooking spray, I like to use Vegeline, found in most industrial kitchens, and then just parchment paper, and that's it. And then we're going to pour the base.
The home bakers can't find Vegeline, right? I've never seen it in the grocery store.
No.
Is it different than like a Pam?
I'm sure the greasing is different. Pam usually has that like buttery flavor, I feel. Vegeline, there's not really much of that. But Pam works great.
I think I know the answer to this, but why do you like the sheet pans for this cake as opposed to 3 8-inch round cake pans?
Maybe it's because I work in like a professional kitchen. We usually like to save the crumbs or whatever and use it for a different product, like cake cups. But you can definitely go in a pan. Not a big deal. I just like how flat it bakes on a sheet pan.
Do you do that with all cakes?
We do, yeah. Unless it's a sponge cake. Then we would go in a full round pan.
So we're going to cut the cake, as we just discussed, with these cake molds after it's baked. Is there a brand? And I think I know the size is usually 8-inch. But is there a brand? And is that a restaurant supply product? Because I feel like we all need to have cake molds.
Amazon has it. I like to use a Teco, but Amazon has it. Restaurant supply stores carry it. I think most places sell it.
I didn't realize a Teco did it, but I guess that makes sense because I have like small biscuit cutters and cookie cutters of a Teco, and it makes sense that they just bring that product up until maybe a 10-inch or a 12-inch. Should I picture just the ring, or is there like a handle on top of the ring?
No handle, just the ring itself. Again, there are different brands. I just find that the Teco brand is a lot sturdier.
And should I picture like a sharp end on both the bottom and the top, or is the top like rimmed?
It's not rimmed, but it's not sharp either.
Okay.
So it's just edged enough so it could cut into the cake.
So you can tell which side to cut with, or you can cut on both sides?
Both sides.
Ooh, I am literally going to buy those.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, and I'm also developing a red velvet cake.
Red velvet cake. Don't forget. I'm waiting.
Those
I'm waiting for
things.
your recipe.
Those 2 things. So we've prepared our sheet pan. We have our cake molds ready. Do you call them cake molds?
Ring molds?
Ring molds. We have our ring molds ready. So first we're going to combine buttermilk, cold brew, vanilla all together. A couple of questions. First of all, do you have a favorite vanilla brand?
I like to use vanilla paste.
Oh, nice. Do you have a favorite paste?
Nielsen
Massey.
Yes.
Yep, that's a really yummy one. Do you make the cold brew yourself or do you buy it?
So we use Grady's cold brew.
I love that.
It's just very concentrated cold brew, so you get a lot of that rich chicory coffee. How else can you describe coffee?
Yeah,
bold coffee flavor.
I love that. And I think that's kind of a brilliant tip because there's so many chocolate cake recipes that call for coffee because we all know a tiny bit of that coffee flavor will pop our chocolate. Won't actually taste like coffee. But the idea of using cold brew is so smart, Susan, because it's so concentrated and a lot of people have it.
Right.
And you can now buy it like that Grady's or other products in the grocery store.
I think most recipes, sometimes I've seen espresso powder. I personally don't love the taste of espresso powder. I feel like it doesn't taste as fresh. I don't know if you agree or not.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Because when I'm developing recipes, I want everything to be so easy and simple, and I want everybody to have it in their pantry. And not that everybody has espresso powder, but
it's more accessible.
I like to use it, even though we don't like that word. I like to use it because it just means that you could buy it once, and then you could be making the cake for years to come, and you would always have it.
You're so right.
Just because some people don't want to go, even though I am going to develop a recipe with cold brew, my fear would be maybe not everyone wants to go to the supermarket to buy it.
Just
and then
to have it in the pantry.
Even with coffee, I feel like a lot of people don't make coffee every day. Or like I make coffee every day, but I don't have like a cup hanging out that I can then bake with. So the espresso powder is just my idea of like you have your boiling water, you have the powder, you can add it to the cake easy
and it's
peasy.
ready for you.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so we're combining our buttermilk, our cold brew, our vanilla. Are we like whisking them together?
Yes, whisk it together.
Yep. And we're going to measure this maybe in a bowl or in a big measuring cup.
Yeah, measuring cup.
Yeah.
Or bowl. Yeah.
And why the buttermilk?
Just, again, I like that extra tang. And it adds to moistness as well.
Tenderness.
Yeah.
And so we'll set our wet ingredients aside. Next, we're going to whisk together all-purpose flour. Is there a brand you guys use?
King Arthur, yeah.
We're going to whisk together King Arthur flour, baking soda, and baking powder. Why are you using both here?
Extra oomph.
Cocoa powder. Do you like Dutch processed cocoa powder? And do you have a brand, or do you like natural cocoa powder?
So we prefer Valrhona, but cacao berry is our next. So Dutch, yeah.
Yeah, I love that Valrhona cocoa powder. I love the
There's
color.
There's nothing that compares
Nothing.
quite like it.
I love that color.
Yeah.
So delicious. And then we're going to add fine sea salt. And I wondered first if there's a brand, and also do you ever use kosher in your baking, or are you a fine sea salt gal?
You could actually use kosher or fine sea salt. We use diamond crystal.
We're going to combine all of this together, whisking it, I presume, in a like big metal bowl. Is that what I should picture? Because that's sort of restaurant supply style. Then we're going to add sugar to this mix. We're whisking this in a bowl. We're not in a stand mixer.
No, you can go in a stand mixer. But I just like to use a big old
of course. And we're going to add sugar to this mixture. Is it granulated or is it brown?
Granulated.
And why not brown? I feel like sometimes people like to add brown to chocolate cake for the molassesy moistness.
So the cold brew that we use already sort of has like a very dark taste to it. It's personal preference, I guess. I prefer just letting the coffee shine through where it can.
Even a choice like that is important to recognize, because there is a difference between what brown sugar is going to taste like and what white sugar is going to taste like.
Sure.
And the cleaner taste of white sugar is sometimes what the dessert needs or the people want. So we're going to add sugar and eggs into the bowl of an electric mixer fitted with our whisk attachment or our paddle.
I would recommend whisk to start, yeah.
And we're going to whisk until the eggs are lightly pale. And is there a particular speed? And are we looking for ribbons?
I would say medium.
Medium speed?
Yeah.
And is that thing where you lift the whisk and you see the mixture ribbon into the bowl?
Yes.
Is that what we're looking for? I mean, you're using probably a Hobart or something big.
We are using a Hobart.
Yeah, so yours is probably much faster than ours. But that can take like 5 minutes.
Yeah. 5 to 7, maybe even longer, depending.
And I'm assuming if you wanted, you could try to do that by hand, or does ribbons take forever by hand?
Gosh, it just reminds me of a story in culinary school when I tried to whisk eggs, and I just literally sprained my wrist trying to whisk eggs.
Honey.
It'll just take a very long time, a lot of elbow grease.
Good to know. Good elbow grease and sprained wrists. Then we're going to whisk in vegetable oil. And now also, could we use melted butter if we wanted to?
You can sub some of it. I wouldn't recommend all of it because, again, I feel vegetable oil adds a different level of moistness that butter just can't. It can't.
I couldn't agree more. I also think that cakes with oil can be kind of left on the counter for longer. They stay fresh and moist and don't dry out. So I'm a big oil and cake person. Next, we're going to whisk in the dry ingredients in 3 additions, alternating with our buttermilk and cold brew vanilla mixture. And I thought it was interesting. Sometimes in my chocolate cake recipes, I actually add the Dutch processed cocoa powder to the wet ingredients just to kind of bloom that chocolate.
Yes.
I usually do that because I'm using hot water and espresso powder. Since yours is not hot, it's a room temp ingredients. Is that sort of why you're choosing to put the Dutch process in with the dry ingredients?
Yeah, I haven't had a real reason to bloom for this recipe. Definitely in a red velvet, I've bloomed it. But it seems to work just fine.
Great.
Just throw it in the bowl here.
And last, we're going to mix in our mayonnaise. Is there a brand that you like?
Duke's.
And we're going to do that on low speed just until it's incorporated into the batter. And I wondered why we're doing it last.
Just worked out that way. Yeah. I know some people like to go in the beginning to coat the flour.
Yeah.
I haven't tried that. This is just kind of how we've experimented the recipe, and it works out fine. So we're like, why change a good thing?
And next, we're going to bake for like 20 to 30 minutes. Do you rotate the sheet pan while it's baking?
I would highly recommend to rotate if you're just baking at home. We were very spoiled, and we have a combi oven that just works wonders, and the fan goes around all the way. But definitely if you're baking at home, I would recommend to rotate halfway.
How will we know when the cake is done? Are there any indicators we're looking for? Do you touch with your finger? Or do you use a toothpick?
So I do all of that. But I also check for the edges of the sheet pan, because what happens is once the cake is cooked all the way through, it'll start to separate from the edges of the sheet pan. And that's one of the clear indicators for me.
And when you do the toothpick, are you like a moist crumb person, or do you want it to see it clean?
Moist crumb.
Yeah, me too. I feel like so frequently people bake too long.
Yeah.
And so I always encourage people to pull when you see a crumb.
Right, just like the tiniest little bit.
Exactly. And then we're going to cool the cake before we're going to cut it with our ring molds. My new term. And I wondered, do we cool it in the pan? Do we flip it out to cool it? What's your technique?
I would just cool it in the pan.
Okay. And then sort of run a butter knife or something around the edge.
Right.
Do you flip it out on a cooling rack and then flip it back up so you're looking at the top?
Yes, to take off the parchment as well on the bottom. Once it's cooled, though, I just go on a flat surface is fine. But cooling in the pan first. Once that's all cool, flip it over onto a flat surface and then peel off the parchment, and then you cut with your rings.
So you're cutting the bottom. The bottom is facing you. And do you have to prepare the ring molds in any way? Do they stick? Like, do you need to spray them?
I guess it really depends on what you're cutting. For this cake, it works fine. I have noticed that it does stick sometimes. So maybe, a light spray of that pan.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
I can't wait to buy my ring molds. I'm like so excited. I don't know why I've been sleeping on ring molds my whole life.
It's great for when you build entremets and like mousses
Tell us what entremets are.
It's like a mousse or something with filling on the inside, like a mousse cake where you put the acetate around it too. That's really helpful to have a ring mold on hand.
And the acetate is sort of that kind of almost like plastic paper, for lack of a better word, that you would stick inside the mold so that you could fill the mold higher than the edge of the mold.
Right.
Love that. I do not think I will be buying acetate, but I love that I can describe it well and you nod.
You're a pro.
Now we're going to make the ganache frosting. So we're going to bring cream and corn syrup and sugar and salt to a light simmer. And I had a couple of questions. Yes. I also use corn syrup but can you remind us why we're putting a teeny bit of corn syrup in?
There's like a pliability to the ganache and it just makes it so glossy. And I think that's why I just love adding corn syrup.
Yeah, me too.
Oh.
I think you can also add like Lyle's golden syrup. And I feel like in some professional kitchens, are people adding glucose? Or am I right that can sort of be subbed out?
Yeah, so that is the original. It comes with glucose, but for this, we use corn syrup because it works just as well.
Nice.
Glucose can get expensive, too. Yeah.
So we're going to bring cream, corn syrup, sugar, I'm assuming it's granulated, and salt. Again, we could use kosher, we could use fine, to a light simmer. So are we looking for sort of just bubbles around the edges?
Yes.
Okay. Just so that we dissolve our sugar, we're whisking occasionally. Now we're going to put unsweetened chocolate, which you refer to as 100% chocolate, which I love that expression for something that has absolutely no sugar in it. Also, I find that helpful because now I understand that the higher number of chocolate is going to be closer to 100% and therefore darker. Teaching at every moment or learning at every moment. And is there a brand of unsweetened or 100% chocolate?
Again, I'm a Valrhona girl.
Yep.
But we also use Cho chocolate.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and Cho is really great.
And so we're going to put the unsweetened chocolate and some semi-sweet chocolate, which is about 66%. Is that Valrhona too?
Yes.
Or Cho. In a bowl. I'm assuming it's a metal bowl like we used earlier. And we're going to pour the hot cream mixture over the chocolates and allow the hot cream to melt the chocolate for about how long before we get in there and whisk?
I would say a few minutes, maybe 3 or 2, just so that we know that if you whisk too early, there's going to be chunks of chocolate. The warm cream is not going to melt the chocolate all the way through. We actually want this to be very melted down and emulsified.
I'm just thinking about this for my own self, making ganache. Is there anything you're looking for in the bowl? Because you can't really tell if it'll look kind of melty on top, let's say, but you can't really tell.
Right.
Is there anything you guys are looking for? Or you just know if you wait about 3 minutes, you're good to go?
I guess, yeah, we're usually at least give it about 3 minutes, or we kind of stick something into the mixture and like move it around to make sure we're not feeling large chunks, and then we'll go in
Great.
finishing also.
So we're going to whisk to incorporate until smooth. Then we're going to add, I assume, room temperature unsalted butter.
Yes.
And why butter?
Who doesn't love butter? No, we need it to set up a little bit. Yeah.
And we're going to add some vanilla. And then we're going to use an immersion blender to blend the ganache until smooth, shiny, homogenized. So a couple of questions. Are we using the immersion blender when the ganache is still warm?
Yes.
Do we all need immersion blenders? Like, are you using them all the time in the pastry kitchen?
I'm a big advocate for having an immersion blender. It just really mixes things up very nicely. You can emulsify things beautifully, and it's handheld and small and compact. It's one of my favorite tools, I would say.
Is there a brand that you like?
Just use a KitchenAid one.
If you were just making a regular ganache and you were not turning this into a frosting, would you still use the immersion blender, or is the immersion blender adding some kind of air into it that we're going to want for the frosting?
I just like it because it's almost like a comforting security to know that everything is blended and smooth. It's great for ganache. I would have to say it's my favorite because, again, elbow grease is required in a lot of pastry and baking. And sometimes an immersion blender, having that on hand is just buzz and you're done. And it really just gets all of it.
So we're going to store our ganache in a container. Should I just picture like a plastic restaurant supply kind of
whatever
situation?
Container of choice.
Store it in a container with plastic on top or some kind of cover and allowed to cool overnight on the counter. I thought that was interesting. So not in the refrigerator.
You can actually store it in the refrigerator, but when you are about to use it, you really just want it to come to room temp. And sometimes we leave it in the fridge. It takes a very long time to thaw down, and you won't be able to pipe it as beautifully or work with it as easily if it was ice cold.
I like the idea of leaving it on the counter. It's just so much easier. And then it keeps the consistency that you want.
Right.
You don't have to bring it back to that consistency. Do you need to do anything to it after it's waited overnight, like blend it again, or it's good to go?
That's it.
Ooh, I love that.
You're good to go.
I love that. And then would you ever frost the cake right away as soon as the ganache is done? Or do you like to let it, well, I guess you have to let it sit because you have to let it set.
Yes. I guess it depends. If you wanted to pour it over something to glaze it, it would work just fine. But I like to pipe my ganaches, so it really needs to set.
So will you spread it with an offset and also pipe? Like, what should we picture when you're ready to frost the cake? What's your technique?
So we spread it on the cake first, and then we'll do the finishing decorating touches by piping it.
Nice. I wanted to talk about a couple of other additional recipes. Can you tell us about your green curry sponge cake?
The dessert is called just simply curry, and we take all of the aromatics that normally come in green curry, minus the onions and the garlic, and we infuse in oil. We make a sponge cake out of that. The cake tastes like curry, but it doesn't have the overly savory notes, just the herbaceous, spicy notes.
You make an infused oil that you use as one of the ingredients in the sponge cake. Oh my gosh, brilliant. I love that. I feel like you could do that in a bunch of other flavors for sponge cake by infusing flavor into oil.
Absolutely.
And is that like a vegetable oil?
It's grapeseed oil.
Grapeseed. Why grapeseed?
It seems to pick up the aromatics better than just plain canola. I'm not sure why. And it's also another neutral oil. Yeah, but I'm sure canola would work fine.
So you have the sponge cake, and then do you have an avocado sorbet and a fish sauce caramel?
Yes, so it comes with a fish sauce caramel and then an avocado sorbet, and on top we foam a soursop yogurt mousse to help round out the dessert, so you get a little bit more of that fatty element that you would get in a curry.
What about your seaweed dessert, which is like a pandan panna cotta set with agar? Describe that one.
So that was inspired by, just seaweed in general, and again, part of our culture and heritage. But more importantly, it's like an untapped ingredient that's not really found normally in pastry or sweet things. And I really wanted to highlight the versatility of that because we don't set our panna cotta with gelatin. We use agar-agar, which is extracted from seaweed. So it's a pandan panna cotta. It's a confit wakame boiled down in sugar syrup. And then we do a chocolate streusel, and then we add on sea beans, which is actually a succulent that tastes like seaweed, and also sea grapes from Vietnam. Hit it with coconut lime foam, and then we put a coconut lime granita on top, so it's very refreshing, but it's umami and sweet, but you get the earthiness from the chocolate, and it kind of just melts right together.
Sounds incredible. And then finally, We talked about durian a little bit, but can you tell us about the kind of white chocolate mousse situation that you make with the durian?
Yeah, I realized that I really wanted to kind of temper the stink from the durian. And the best way I was able to do that was to mix it with white chocolate. So it mellows it out and just brings out more of the floral, vanilla-y notes from the fruit. We pair that with some acid. My acid of choice is passion fruit. And to give it like a herbaceous note to it, we pair it with dill, which you wouldn't think would work, but it works beautifully.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Susan. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Oh, you're my cherry pie, Jessie. Thanks for having me.
Of course. That's it for today's show. Thank you to California Prunes for supporting this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your baking pals about us. You can find today's recipe at cherrybombe.com. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bombe Podcast Network and is recorded at CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Elizabeth Vogt. Our associate producer is Jenna Sadu, and our content and partnerships manager is London Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!